So there is 4 sessions today. The first one will be about the Sustainable Energy and Climate Action Plans, or called SEAP-SECAPs. It will be about data collection for the baseline review. The second session will be energy management. The third one will be about energy supply and production. And the fourth one will be about the transports. So what are the objectives of today? Is to understand this importance of this systematically timely and periodic gathering of the energy data. Usually this is one of the hardest part to receive and to find all the necessary data about the energy consumptions, about the building stocks, about the facilities that we are looking for the improvement, and so on. So it is objective to understand the need for this improving data sharing, to improve the data gathering, sharing, and management of this data. And of course, to able to contribute this improving data and sharing through agreements and other collaborations between the energy suppliers, energy consumer, and so on. And of course, to be able to use some tools and methodologies for data retrieving, quality of energy estimation, and to calculation baseline emission inventory. So let's start with the session 1. This will be the longest session, so maybe we will do this session 1 and then we'll have a break, or then we have 3 another session which are quite shorter. But let me start with the preparation of the baseline emission inventory for the SEAP-SECAPs. As I said, this is Sustainable Energy and Action Plans, Climate Action Plans as well. So there is a lot of directives to have this legal background. One of the most important directive is from 2012. It's a directive on the energy efficiency, and this is the main legislation tool of the European Commission, and which set up the goals and the obligations of the member states in the field of the energy efficiency and using the renewables energy. So one of the most important paragraph of this European directive is that your EU countries, your member states, they are obligated to make energy efficient renovation of at least 3% of the building stocks per year of all the buildings owned and occupied by the central government. In 2020, there was also a Repower EU plan of the European Commission proposed to raise the ambitions further to reduce EU reliance on the fossil fuels. And of course, this gives us a little bit more complicated obligations until 2030, 2035, and finally to 2050. So the European climate law, it is one of the main goals, one of the main laws, and sets the European Green Deal for the Europe's economy and society to become climate neutrality by 2050. There is intermediate target, of course, by 2030. We would like to achieve at least 50% of this climate neutrality compared to the 1990 years. So the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan are based mainly on the requirements laid down in this Article 24 of this 2012 and 27 EU directives, where all member states of Union must submit energy action plans by 2014. Most of the countries were on time, but not all of them. Slovenia was one of the latest one. But also the member states encourage public authorities, in this case municipalities, not only municipalities, but in some cases regional local authorities, to create and adopt energy efficiency plan with clear goals and objectives, and to putting in place also the energy management. We will talk about this energy management a little bit in the second session. as part of their implementation of their plans. So the EU member states encouraging municipalities to create their own energy action plans. In Europe, most famous one is the SEAP, Sustainable Energy Action Plans, but also the member states have a different kind of these local energy plans. In Slovenia, for example, we have a so-called local energy concept. It is very similar to Sustainable Energy Action Plans. Only a few different things apply in the local energy concepts. So, following this adaptation of this European Union's climate and energy package in 2008, the European Commission launched the Covenant of Mayors to endorse and support the efforts of the local authorities in the implementation of sustainable energy policies. The Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy is the mainstream of Europeans' voluntary, we have to admit, we have to highlight this is voluntary movement involving local authorities in the development and implementation of sustainable energy and climate policies. What is the difference between SEAP and SECAP? Well, the SEAP set a goal to reduce at least 20% of CO2 emissions by 2020, and the SECAP set a new target, even higher objectives. It's 40% reductions of the CO2 emission or CO2 equivalent by the year 2030. So both of these action plans is the key document which shows how the covenant signatory will reach its vision and targets. What is SECAP? This is a main document which was launched in October 2015, following the very successful initiative of the Covenant of Mayors by the preparing of SEAPs. So the signatories of the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy have committed to prepare these action plans by 2030, which is the main difference comparing to the SEAP. So the main target of the SECAP is defining mitigation actions that allow to cutting down at least 40% of these CO2 emissions. It is expected to do it by 2030, and the SECAP must be submitted within 2 years of joining the Covenant of Mayors. So after 2 years, when you commit yourself to achieve 40% reductions. The SECAP plan formats of 2 parts. First one is mitigation. This is very similar to SEAP, and adaptation to the climate changes. In the SEAP, there is only mitigation. We will talk about this in the following of this first session. So, what is the main difference? The main difference is that in SECAP, adaptation to climate change is required. So we are talking about the adaptations, not mitigation, the climate changes, which is the part of the SEAP. In SECAP, the member states, the members, municipality have to develop risk and vulnerability assessments. So this is the main difference comparing to the SEAP. And today we will dedicated this first session to the mitigation of the climate changes and adaptations of the climate changes. So the SECAP represents this local strategy for the municipality to become a territory where its citizens can continue to develop their life, business, and other activities despite the threats of the climate changes. So that means that they adapt to these influences of the climate changes. And for this, it is essential to have a knowledge of the municipality, physically, socially, and economically, as well as valid information about the impacts that climate change could have on its to the territory and its citizens. As said, the SECAP is divided in the 2 distinctive parts. The first focus on diagnosing by analyzing the territory and the climate through the developing the baseline emission inventory and the climate change risk and vulnerability assessment. The second focus is defining on the action plan. The development of SECAP primarily draws on the findings from this baseline emission inventory and the risk and vulnerability assessment. And through this combination of these aspects, the SECAP defines concrete measures for both climate mitigation, adaptation with timeframes and assigned responsibilities, and of course, within the financial capabilities of the local authorities. Targets of the main targets sectors for the climate mitigation. When we're talking about the climate change or emission mitigation, the main sectors are building, equipment facilities, and urban transport. These are the areas where the municipality has direct influence and direct power to do something. And when we are talking about the climate adaptations of the SECAPs, we can also refer on the buildings, transport, energy, water and waste treatment, land use, planning and environmental and biodiversity, agriculture and forestry, health, civil protection, emergency, tourism, and other territories. So when we are talking about the adaptation of the climate change, we have a very wide range of the activities that we can cover according to the mitigation. So what are the methodologies used? There is several methodologies in the EU, but we will mainly refer to the guidebook How to Develop Sustainable Energy and Climate Action Plans by the Joint Research Centers, and the guidelines for this preparing of the SECAPs which are recommended by the Covenant of Mayors. So the starting point of the SECAP is this baseline emission inventory. So the baseline review. The starting point is to assess this current situation or establishing a baseline review. The main purpose of the baseline review is to establish a clear picture of where we are at the moment, descriptions of the city's current situation in terms of energy and climate change. Baseline review consists of both of baseline emission inventory and risk and vulnerability assessment. Elaborating the emission inventory is the first part of this baseline review. Emission inventory is the base for mitigation, which is based on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, mainly CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And mitigation is achieved through two main measures: the reductions of the energy demand by improving the energy efficiency of processes and services, and the increase in the use of the renewable energy sources. The second part is risk and vulnerability assessment. This assessment is based for the adaptation measures, and adaptation is based on designing effective actions to adapt municipality to climate changes, and it is achieved through collecting data on climate variables and other risk elements. I will show you later on how these variables and risk elements are calculated and how do we assess these elements. So when we are talking about baseline emission inventory, well, when we're talking about mitigation in the local fight against climate change, is based on these reductions of the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 or CO2 equivalent, such as methane and and other emissions. The assessment part permits to know the starting situation in terms of emissions generated by the energy consumptions at the local level. This is done through this emission inventory. These inventories, together with the territorial context, will result in a collection of measures duly quantified in their scope, cost, and their impact, which must allow achieving the targets, which is in the SECAP at least 40% by 2030. And important aspect to consider is the analysis of demographic and urban evaluation. Establishing this baseline emission inventory is the starting point for the SECAP processes, from which it is possible to move to relevant objective settings, elaboration of adequate action plan, and monitoring. The baseline review needs to be based on this existing data. This emission inventory should reflect the local situation. This is why it should always be based on the local data on energy consumption or productions and other information necessary to prepare the inventory. Assessment and estimation based on the national or regional means will not reflect the real situation locally. This is very important, especially in the city and the town, since in most cases they are characteristics of specific territory position. This is sometimes very difficult since we are facing the lack of data on local level. And for example, it is very difficult to assess emission inventory from the transport because we don't have exact numbers of, for example, specific cars, how many diesel, how many electric vehicles, how many gasoline, and so on. So in these cases, we have to estimate, and we will talk about this estimation and extrapolations later today. Well, there is no unified basis for this emission inventory elaboration. There is many different guidelines, methodologies, and tools available for compilation of these local inventories, such as this Climate Alliance, Local Governments for Sustainability. But we will mostly refer to the Covenant of Mayors guidelines, as this is one of the main guidelines used in the Europe. So using these guidelines allows us to compare, to do the benchmarking analysis with other cities and regions in the EU. And it's very important to use as much as possible internationally agreed standards, which shall be followed on this one, especially when it comes to the baseline emission factors of the specific greenhouse gas. We will use on this international panel for the climate changes regulation and guidelines, and European references for life cycle databases. Well, this emission inventory should at least the sectors where the local authorities intend to measures, where it's possible to make measures and where it's possible to define the measures which will be impacted and implemented. It is very important to use this reliable information mostly in the context of the common sense vision of reality, and that's the information that are reflecting the current situation in the city. So it is very important to gather as much as possible data to be as much as possible reliable and accurate. The process of this input data collection, the sources of this data and calculation methodology should be always duly documented. This is in the case if something is lost or if some person is replaced on this activity. So everything have to be duly documented to everybody understand how we received this data and how we calculated all the emission factors. So, as I said, we will mainly use this Covenant of Mayors methodology. There is online available how to develop sustainable energy and climate action plan guidelines. Also from the Climate Alliance is very much used in the Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and other countries, but maybe mostly first. Also, there is some donors also have some their own guidelines, like European Investment Bank, European Bank for the Research and Development, and so it depends on the sources, financial sources. Also depends on which guidelines you should use. But they're basically they're very much similar. They're very much common, and we will, as I said, mostly we will refer to the Covenant of Mayors. So when we're talking about baseline emission inventory, it is very important to have these 6 keys. We will talk about these keys on the further slides. So to set the boundaries, define the clear scope. We will define the baseline year, choosing accounting approach, choosing which greenhouse gas should be included. What are the emission factors? These emission factors mainly vary due to the countries. For example, electricity emission factors are not the same across the Europe. And of course, to identify the key target sectors. Boundaries and define the clear scopes. Of course, in Europe, there's base emission inventory on the administrative boundaries. It's called NUTS. This is a nomenclature of units for territorial statistics. But basically, we have to define 3 types of these greenhouse gas emissions. The first one are direct emissions, which physically occur from the sources in this administrative territory. The second one are indirect emissions, so energy consumed but not produced in these local territories. This is mainly refers to the electrical energy, and non-energy related direct emissions that occur on the territory. So the CO2, but not also the CH4 and N2O. So this is very important, and this is something that we will focus on this further today. So the second one is the baseline year. It is highly recommended to be year 1990, but it is very difficult to achieve all the data from 1990. So it is mostly recommended to choose the year you have most comprehensive and reliable data, which should be the closest to the subsequent year. But at least for the SEAP, it was recommended not to be later than 2005. When we are talking about the goals about 2030 and 40 and later, of course, we can use also the later year. So, but it have to be communicated with the Covenant of Mayors administration. So, but always keep the same baseline. Even if the target change, always keep the same baseline year and use the year you have a most comprehensive and most reliable data. There are 2 accounting approach possible. One is activity-based approach, and the other one is life cycle assessment approach. We highly recommend, because we are talking about the municipalities, to use activity-based approach. So the CO2 emissions, which are calculated by applying conversion factors to energy consumption data. So by multiplying this final energy consumption by the corresponding emissions factors, we are, as I said, we are recommended the activity-based approach, which is one of the most commonly used in the frame of this covenant. In this approach, all the CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions that occur due to the energy consumption within this territory of the local authorities, either directly, like a fuel combustions, or indirectly, consumptions of the electricity and heat and cold, are included. So this principle considers all consumption within particular spatial territory. These greenhouse emissions are directly estimated from the carbon content of the fuel. Thus, a small amount of the carbon is unoxidized. That's less than 1%. So these are the losses are as a result and unoxidized. It is the approach used for the national reporting in the frame of United Nations for climate changes emissions, whereas emissions of the CH4 and the N2O are secondary importance for the combustion process and the residential and the transport sectors. The life cycle approach, this is also an internationally standardized approach, originally developed for the products' environmental footprints. It is particularly suitable for assessing potential trade-offs between different types of environmental impacts associated with specific policy and management decision, and includes also the emissions from the whole supply chain and not only from the final combustions, like for example from the energy extractions to productions, transport, use, and recycling, and offering, of course, more accurate pictures of the emissions related to both energy productions and uses. This is of special relevance for biofuels and biomass. It is highly recommended when we are talking about the biomass to include life cycle assessment. But on the other hand, I would strongly recommend to have activity-based approach, which are not complicated and not so complex to account. Of course, there are some advantages. It is very much activity-based, is very much compatible with national reporting, both for the UNFCCC and the Covenant of Mayors. It is more compatible with the monitoring progress of 2030 Climate and Energy Framework. All emission factors are easily available. But when we are talking about the life cycle analysis, this is more compatible with the carbon footprint approaches that we see on the some utility devices, home appliance devices, and other devices. It's compatible with eco-design energy labeling of the EU directives, and also reflects the total environment impact also outside of the place of the use, not only inside of the given territory, and further support the choice of the most climate-friendly biofuels and biomass. And both tools are available for the local inventories. Which greenhouse gas have to be included? Well, in activity-based approach, following the IPCC, International Plan for the Climate Changes principles, is chosen. And if only energy-related activity sectors are included in this emission inventory, it is sufficient to report only CO2 emission. Well, however, also gather greenhouse gases can be included in this emission inventory if the activity-based approach is chosen. For example, the local authority may decide to use emission factors that take into account also the methane, CH4, and N2O emission, and also can be included. In this case, the emission reporting should use unit tons of CO2 equivalent. When we are talking about the life cycle, so in the case of this life cycle approach, in addition to the CO2, other greenhouse gases might play an important role. So therefore, if the local authorities decide to use the LCA approach, will likely include also other greenhouse gas than CO2 in the inventory. In this case, emission reporting unit tons of CO2 equivalent should be used. If the local authority uses the methodologies and tools that does not include any other greenhouse gas than CO2, then the inventory will be based on CO2 only. So the unit will be tons of CO2 and not CO2 equivalent. So the emissions of other greenhouse gases than CO2 are converted into the CO2 equivalent by using these global warming potential values, which shall be kept constant all along monitoring inventories later on. So emission factors. When we're talking activity-based and territorial approach, the most common tools is IPC guidelines to be used, and it's very simple, easily accessible, and it's in line with this international reporting, for example, as the Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC as well. When we are talking life cycle approach, which requires emission factors, these include embodied emissions that occur upstream, so emissions required to extract, transform, transport the fuel up to the city. This is more complex, but it gives us better view to the global impact of the activities occurring on the specific territory. So the IPCC emission factors cannot be used in the LCA approach. The disadvantage of the LCF factors are that they are much more challenging to obtain. So it is more complex and much more difficult to receive and to obtain all these factors. So they can be, example, obtained or calculated with the help of this Covenant of Mayors or European Life Cycle database. But I would say it's much more complex to use this as life cycle analysis. Emission factors, they can be chosen between the local emission factors or default national EU global factors. When choosing activity-based territorial emission inventory approach, the local authority can either use local emission factors or this European one, such as IPCC. But there are also Covenant of Mayors default emission factors provided in how to develop SECAP guidelines and to cover the most commonly used energy carriers. These emission factors are also regularly updated. So European Investment Bank carbon footprint methodology also provides a series of emission factors which have been derived from internationally recognized sources. Emission factors should be relevant to the territory boundary, specific to the activity being measured and sourced from credible government, industrial, or academic sources. It is absolutely encouraged to use local emission factors, as emission factory should be relevant to the particular situation in the local authority. And therefore, if local authorities prefer to use local, regional, or country-specific emission factors or develop their own emission factor based on the detailed properties of the fuels used within their local authorities. If no local, regional, or country-specific sources are available in this, or in the case of local factors appear to be understood, then local authorities should use default factors, preferably from the IPCC, but also from, for example, from Covenant of Mayors or European Investment Bank guidelines. So, what are the key target sectors? Emission inventory shall focus on the energy-related sectors, municipal buildings and its infrastructures, street lighting, public and private transport, and other services. It is very important that you choose the sectors where local authorities have a huge influence or greater influence, even though the scope could be enlarged to the other sectors in which they take specific actions. Emissions in sectors over which they have no control should be excluded, such as this associated to large-scale power plants, more than 20 megawatt of the capacity covered by cap and trade schemes or similar, energy-intensive industry and aviation regulated under the European emission trading systems, and thus falling under national rather than local responsibility. For example, in the Covenant of Mayors, the mitigation commitment is related mainly to the emission associated with energy consumptions in sector which can be influenced by the local authority, housing, services, and urban transport, leaving out other emitters such as emission trading scheme industry and transport outside the mandate of the local authorities, for example, highway, and other activity sectors such as aviation and shipping, nuclear energy, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and carbon capture and storage technologies. Decay target, building, equipment, other facilities mainly owned by the municipality, transport, current transport within the local authorities, but we are not talking about these highways, interstate railways, and aviation and shipping. There is also other non-energy related, such as wastewater treatment, water treatment, and other. And of course, the energy supplies. We will dedicate to the energy supplies the last sessions of today's course. It is very important to have these monitoring tools, the tracking emissions over the time. It is very important component of this greenhouse gas emission inventory because it provides information on historical emission trends and tracks the efforts of policies and actions to reduce emissions. All emissions over the time should be estimated consistently, which means that as far as possible, the time series should be calculated using the same method, data sources, and boundary definitions in all years. So one of the principles of the CO2 emission inventory is that inventories are consistent through the years, from the baseline year to the target year, if you have a set target year. Both the data collections and emission inventory, activity-based or life cycle, appears should be maintained. Particular attention has to be brought on the keeping the same included or excluded activity sectors all along the implementation process. So when making monitoring emission inventories, the same tool can be used. The same Excel or any other tool you might have used when creating baseline inventory. It is recommended to monitor emissions on a yearly basis. These advantages of this one are that you have a closer monitoring and better understanding of the various factors that influence these CO2 emissions, an annual input to policy making, allowing quicker reactions, and the specific expertise necessary for inventories can be maintained and consolidated. Well, in some cases, there are some recalculations have to be done. In general, once the emission inventory is completed, there is no need to change or recalculate anything in the baseline emission inventory later on. But as I said, there might be some, however, there are some few occasions when this recalculation of emission analysis is necessary to ensure that these reported trends and in emission reflects the real changes in the emissions instead of the other factors. So the changes in the inventory boundaries, for example, a category previously regarded as insignificant has grown to the point where it should be included in the inventory. But no emission regulations are needed for activities that either did not exist in the base year or reflect a natural increase or decrease in the city activity. This is known as organic growth. There are changes in calculation methodology or improvements in the data accuracy. The city may report the same sources of these greenhouse gas emissions as in previous year, but measure or calculate them differently. For example, new information on these local emission factors to be used instead of defaults one, or correction of the heat consumption for outside the temperature. So normalizing the heat consumption with the heating degree days. There might be some industry delocalization. So if you're having a heavy industry moved out of the city or coming into the city, adding or removing optional activity sectors, discovering of significant errors. This is a number of cumulative errors that are collectively significant should also be considered as a reason to recalculate this emission. And in some cases, methodological changes, this is highly not recommended, only in case if needed. So if you're doing recalculations, please make sure that this is to be consistent as well in the recalculations and to be fully documented so you can always justify in case if somebody skipping actions or is in case of the revision of these action plans. So now we are going to the second part of the SECAP, which is the risk and vulnerability assessment. This is the second most important part of this baseline review. Risk and vulnerability assessment will allow the definition of appropriate adaptation strategies which will translate into the SECAP's actions to and contribute to improve the resilience of the territory to the climate changes. So European cities are heavily vulnerable to the impacts of the climate changes, especially in the recent time. We have noticed huge heat, huge flooding, water scarcity and droughts. And this can impact not only the health, but also the infrastructures, local economies, and especially the quality of the life of the inhabitants. So adaptation means anticipating the adverse effects of the climate change and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause, or taking advantage of the opportunities that might arise. It has been shown that well-planned and early adaptation action saves money and also some lives. So municipalities are exposed to the series of these climate hazards. Depends mostly on the geographical location and the climate trends above dimensions. So here we are talking according to the Covenant of Mayors. We have to take into the consideration extreme cold and heat, heavy precipitations, so heavy rainfall, snowfall, fog, or recently hail, huge floods, flash and surface flood, river flood, coastal flood, also groundwater flood, and permanent inundation, droughts and water scarcity, storms, mass movement. We're talking about the landslide, avalanches, rockfalls, or subsidence. In Southern Europe, there is a lot of wildfires, especially forests and the land fire. Also some chemical changes, saltwater intrusion, ocean acidification, or atmospheric CO2 concentrations. There are also biological hazards, like waterborne disease, airborne disease, or insect infestation, and others. This is all in the, mainly these hazards are reflecting the Covenant of Mayors guidelines how to prepare the SECAPs. The most common approach for this risk and vulnerability assessment is indicator-based vulnerability assessment. Indicator-based vulnerability assessment has been widely used to assess climate change vulnerability in urban context. And this approach is particularly suitable for smaller and mid-sized cities, since it doesn't demand particularly technical skills or modeling tools and can be used public available data sets. Using this approach also allows comparability of results and the possibility of benchmarking European cities in terms of vulnerability to climate change. This approach consists of the 5 steps, which we have here, and we will go in more details in the next slides. So the step 1 is exploratory analysis with the key stakeholders. So to be able to better assess the risk of specific municipality, it is necessary to carry out an analysis of all the historical events that have affected the municipality in the recent year or even decades, since they can serve as indication of potential events that could occur in the future. In this phase, all available documents that provide information on events related to the climate change and natural disasters are collected. So we are talking about the floods, avalanches, heat island effect, heat waves, and so on. The main source information should be mapped. City agencies, civil protections, utility companies, and the universities, among others, should all be mapped. For example, information on flood areas can be obtained from data provided by the river basin management authorities. Data related to avalanches and wildfires can be gathered from civil protection programs. Historical information on floods, avalanches, and other hazards, as well as the corresponding trends analyzed, should be summarized in a specific table, which is, you can see it here on the right part of your screen. And example, this is example from the SECAP from the Belgrade in Serbia. This is how to list and describe these historical events. So the second step is to identify climate hazards for the city. As a first course assessment can be done with the help of the following pictures, so that you have which are the most common hazards in particular parts of the Europe. Unfortunately, I have this only picture for the Europe, since we have a lot of guest participants today from also from the outside of the Europe. But you can mainly reflect on this one also into the other parts, you know, comparing to the south, north, east Atlantic parts of the Europe can be reflected also into the outside of the Europe territories. The hazard, there's many easily accessible sources of information about the climate changes, about the hazards, projection and data, especially in the Europe. These are technical reports by European and multilateral agencies. There's a data sharing platforms and national, international meteorological centers, such as, for example, European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast. All the links are here. You can see there's a lot of potentially information available online. How to summarize some of the local climate hazards based on their quality assessments. So these hazards need to be assessed in order to be able later to articulate concrete actions for reducing in the action plans. So this is from the guidelines, Covenant of Mayors guidelines, how to summarize and how to visualize all these hazards. This is also one of the pictures example how to put into the chart this quantification of the local climate hazards based on their qualitative assessments. This is from the Life Adapt SEAP-SECAP guide. This way it is easier to recognize the hazards, those that pose a greater risk on the municipalities. So the third step will be assessment of local vulnerabilities to climate change. So after we define the hazards, the next step follows, which is assessing local vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities can be understood as the capacity that the system has to cope with the local with the hazards described in these previous steps. So if you're talking about extreme heat, cities near big rivers are less vulnerable than the ones at the islands or extreme fire. Different on dry areas compared to the inlands with a lot of mountain streams and a lot of freshwater availability. So this is the example of the assessment of these local vulnerabilities to the climate changes. The Covenant of Mayors also distinguish two major types of the vulnerabilities: socio-economical vulnerabilities, which includes also the growth of these populations, the density of this population, percent share of these sensitive populations, about the elderly people, young people, living alone, unemployment, percent share of the population living in a high-risk area where the floods, fires, avalanches, and the presence of the areas not accessible for municipal services, which are not, they have a heavy, they have very difficult roads to, very difficult access to their place. So they have not utility services. They don't have other services that might are benefiting other areas. Also, percent share of the population with a low culture level, and economic activity sensitive to the climate changes, which is like agricultures and fisheries. The other type of the vulnerabilities is physical and environmental vulnerabilities. Presence of affected coastal areas, this is mainly in the southern Europe. Presence of affected rivers in where there is a huge industrial, there is a huge heavy industrial transport networks in areas at risk, buildings in areas at risk, age of the buildings. For example, in Slovenia, we have a very old building stocks, but not ancient building stocks. We have old building stocks, mostly from the 60s and 70s, with a very low ratio of the insulation of the buildings. So these are very sensitive buildings. We have then it's air pollution, water and soil pollution, urban heat islands, so where there's very hot places inside the territory, and difficult access to areas at risk for emergency services. And also there is a huge part of the forest covering, or the areas where there was huge deforestations occurred. So it is important to identify at least resilient sectors regarding climate change, which will be the main targets of the action plan for the adaptations of the municipality. The Covenant of Mayors proposes in a non-exclusive way the following sectors. So the buildings, mainly the buildings which are owned by the municipality, so municipal, residential, if possible, to have an influence, territory, public or private. Then it's the transport, so all the road, rail, air, and water transport, which are related infrastructures, and there is a possible influence of the municipality. Energy refers to the energy supplies and services and the related infrastructures, so transmission, distributions, generating system, and so on, for all the energy types, so coal, petroleum, natural gas, combustible, renewables, and waste, electricity, and heat. Also, the water refers to the water supply services and also to the related infrastructures, and also the waste, including activities related to the management, collections, treatment, disposal, burning, classification of this waste from various forms of waste, such as solid, non-solid, as well contaminated ones. This is also the visualization, how the results of this task can be represented in the form or in the table. This is also the example from the SEAP-SECAP of the Belgrade. It is also very interesting to identify the population groups which are most vulnerable to each climate hazards. This is according to the Covenant of Mayors suggestions, the following groups: women, girls and children, youth, elderly people, marginalized people, and others. So, step 4, gathering data and processing. City socioeconomic indicators and information about the built environment and biophysical attributes can be extracted from existing database at local, regional, and national level. So the Urban Act database provides a comparable set of the indicators, mainly socio-economic, with European coverage. There is also Urban Vulnerability Mapbook platform provides useful map and data at the city level about urban capacity for response, governance, resources, and economic status, among others. And it produces maps per climatic threats, including heat waves, water scarcity and droughts, flooding, and forest fires. Factors that tend to increase vulnerability to specific climate impacts have been grouped into vulnerability dimensions, namely exposure, sensitivity, and response capacity. So there's also National Statistical Institute, European Statistical System, social vulnerability to climate change in European cities. This is a technical paper discuss the concept of the social vulnerability and socially just adaptation to the climate change. Step 5, once local vulnerabilities to climate hazards have been identified, it is necessary to access them according to the 3 parameters. The first one is exposures. Information about the location and characteristic of local assets must be collected. And this could result in a map or in a table or in other chart, relevant places in their level of exposure to different threats, which should be georeference, for example, on the Google Earth platform. The other one is sensitivity. In the context of this risk assessment, this term refers to the degree to which a system could be affected or is capable of responding to hazard. Sometimes this sensitivity is determined by how relevant and critical that asset is for the municipality. And the third one is adaptive capacity. It will be determined by the existence of the technical and scientific knowledge, as well as the financial capacity and other factors mentioned in the next point, which favor to carry out adaptation actions against such as vulnerability. This is also the table how to present this exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And this is an example of the chart, how this can be presented. The impact risks. These risks can be identified for each affected sector. Impact risk is a climate hazard in conjunction with local vulnerability. In other words, the identified vulnerability must be associated with the climate hazard to which they apply, obtaining a set of the possible impacts produced by this climate change. In order to assess each of the risks of the Covenant of Merit defines three criteria. It is likelihood of occurrences, expected impact level, and time frame. So after the complete analysis of the situation carried out so far, it will not be difficult to quantitatively assess each of these criteria. And once again, in order to obtain numerical values, a value is assigned to each of the categories corresponding to the qualitative assessments. In this way, the climate-related impact risks can be prioritized according to their importance and define the most appropriate adaptation measures for the municipality. The results of this assessment is collected in the table and also can be presented in the chart of this quantification of this climate impact risk in the municipality. So, risk and vulnerability assessment determines the nature and the extent of this risk by analyzing potential hazard and assessing the vulnerability that could pose from such threats. So hazards plus vulnerabilities defines the risks. We have finished the session 1.